Hi, everyone. I want to talk about inspiration, the inspiration that allows and motivates you to overcome even the greatest obstacles. And I want to share with you the story of my experiences with HERATS, which is a nonprofit organization that I helped found. And through it, I hope to share with you how I was able to find my inspiration. So the story begins when I was in middle school, when I first visited my aunts and uncles from my father's side in China. It was my first time really meeting them. And I learned very quickly that they were kind, they were generous, they were loving. But what I also learned was that none of them had ever been able to go to school. Because their family was impoverished, even at a young age, they were forced to work the fields in order to put food on the table, because if they didn't, they would starve. My father was the only one in the family who was lucky enough to be able to go to school. And it was because of his education that he was able to go on to attend a college and then go on to come to America, the land of opportunities. But his siblings weren't as lucky. Without an education, when they grew up, they were forced to be farmers as well. And that's how they live today. And because they were never able to go to school, none of them even knew how to write their own names. But I learned that this problem wasn't just a problem that was faced by my father's family. It was a problem that plagued millions of people around the world. And it's what's known as the cycle of poverty. Rural farmers who start out impoverished must have their children's help in order to work the fields, in order to earn enough money for them to survive. And because of this, because their children cannot obtain an education, they're forced to become farmers as well when they grow up. And thus, when their children are born, they also cannot attend school. And this is the cycle of poverty that traps millions of people around the world. And so when I learned about this problem, I knew I wanted to make a difference. I knew I wanted to make a change, which is why I helped found HEARTS, which is a nonprofit organization that provides education to those children who wouldn't be able to do so otherwise. I wanted to help those millions of people around the world. That was my inspiration. And I knew it would be difficult. I knew it would be daunting. The only problem was I didn't quite know how difficult it would be. You see, it sounds nice to say, oh, I'm going to help millions of people around the world. But what does that really mean? What does that mean in terms of the difficulties you're going to be facing every single day? Well, I learned that it meant facing a lot of failures. It meant calling people one at a time, trying to get donations, a large majority of which ended with a rejection. It meant spending hours and hours to host fundraisers, only for less than 10 people to show up. It meant at times planning and carrying out events completely by yourself because the rest of your officer team is busy with other priorities. It was difficult. A lot of times it was demoralizing. And it would be a lie to say that I didn't consider quitting at least a few times. I would just ask myself, who would really care if I just quit right now? Would anyone really be affected? And so it was during this time when I was realizing just how difficult it was to run a nonprofit organization that I realized my original inspiration simply wasn't enough. I did want to help millions of people around the world. But when it came down to it, when it came down to the difficulties I faced every day, that motivation wasn't enough. Because it really didn't mean that much to those millions of people whether or not I put in that extra little bit of effort, whether or not I made those last few phone calls. It didn't make that much of a difference to them, and that's why it wasn't enough. And it was around this time that I met a young boy. This is Li Xin. He's a young child in China. And I met him when I was visiting the students that HEARTS was supporting. At around this time, we were supporting 30 or so children in various areas in China. And on our trip to visit these students, I remember an almost surreal experience. I remember standing in a classroom in one of the villages, such as you can see here. I remember standing in the middle of that classroom, and around me, the HEARTS members were laughing and playing with some of the students. But what stood out to me was a small boy who's sitting in a corner, just by himself. That was Li Xin. Now, he's sitting at his desk, just by himself, hunched over, scribbling something onto a sheet of paper. And what really stood out to me was the intensity in his eyes. I immediately knew that whatever he was doing had his complete and utter focus. And so I tried to approach him. I wanted to see what he was doing because I was curious. But as I walked closer and I saw what he was doing, I just stopped and I just stared for a good few seconds. Because he wasn't writing a letter, he wasn't writing a story as I thought he was doing. All he was doing was writing his name over and over again and committing it to his memory. It was such a surreal experience for me. And it brought me back to when I'd first started working with HERATS. The reason I had begun working with the organization was because my aunts and my uncles never knew how to write their own names. And now I realized that my work had empowered a child to do so. For the first time, I felt that what I was trying to accomplish with HERATS was finally coming to fruition. And so I couldn't stop thinking about that experience with Li-Xin. I couldn't stop thinking about the rest of the trip. And almost unbeknownst to me, Li-Xin became my new inspiration. Whenever I faced something that didn't go my way, whenever I faced a difficulty, such as a fundraiser with low turnout, I asked myself, if I just quit now, who would really be affected? And I remembered what my work meant to Li-Xin's education. And so I kept going. Whenever I felt like quitting and I asked myself, would anyone really be affected if I just stopped right now? I remembered Li-Xin, and I remembered that if I stopped right now, he wouldn't be able to finish school. And so I forced myself to keep going. I realized that my original motivation, my original inspiration for helping millions of people was just not enough. And instead, what I should have been focusing on were the small inspirations. My inspiration had transformed from something from a large scale to just focusing on one student. Because, as I said, in the grand scheme of things, to those millions of students, it didn't matter whether or not I put in that extra bit of effort to raise $100 more for the students. It didn't make that much of a difference to those millions of children. But to just one student, to Li-Xin, that $100 meant an entire year of education. It's good to have overarching goals. But when it comes down to the difficulties you face every single day, when it comes down to facing the rejection from phone calls, when it comes down to facing the demoralizing, reality that your fundraiser, which you took so long to plan, only had 5 people come, it's the small inspirations that keep you going and keep you from quitting. And so I hope each of you can find your own Li-Xin. Find that one thing that drives you to keep moving forward, keep improving despite all the setbacks and despite all the obstacles. Maybe it's a role model you look up to. Maybe it's a compliment a friend gave you once about your work. But whatever it is, hold on to it, because it will be invaluable to your success. Find your small inspiration, because it's those small inspirations that make the biggest difference. Thank you.